Hej,
Vi er gruppe 9
og vi har lavet et interview
med Craig Holman,
fra Washington
som er lobbyist.
for Public Citizen,
Og vi har spurgt om nogle spørgsmål.
som går ud på, hvad han mener omkring det undercover lobbyisme.
Vi synes, I skal se dem.
We were created back in the 1970s by an activist named Ralph Nader. Have you heard of Ralph Nader?
No.
You haven't? All right. He was a guy who just came out of law school in the early 1970s, and he was trying to get some automobile safety provisions done here on Capitol Hill in Congress. And he noticed that every major corporation in the United States had lobbyists on the Hill. The only people who weren't represented was the public, citizens in general. Yeah. So he created this group called Public Citizen to try to give citizens a lobbying presence here on Capitol Hill. And our primary purpose is to challenge corporate power wherever it is, to try to represent the public's interests and citizens' interests, consumer rights, consumer advocacy. I'm a lobbyist who focuses on campaign finance issues, governmental ethics, lobby reform, those types of issues. Our whole purpose is to try to make sure that citizens are represented here on Capitol Hill and not just corporations.
All right, thank you.
So, how does the lobbying in the US take place? Can you give an example?
Sure, it's gone through a number of big changes, actually. When I first started lobbying here many years ago, lobbying on Capitol Hill, it sort of gone through a whole cycle, actually. Lobbying on Capitol Hill was largely the purview of the very wealthy corporate interests. Lobbyists, I want to clarify, first of all, I'm not opposed to lobbying. Lobbying in the United States, and should be in every democracy, is a constitutional right. People need to be able to contact their legislators and explain to them what their interests are, what they're concerned about, and offer advice to legislators. Legislators have to deal with so many fields. I mean, they can't possibly know everything. And so the role of lobbyists, the legitimate role of lobbyists, is to provide information and expertise to lawmakers so they can make better decisions. Unfortunately, lobbying has become essentially corrupted by money. Many of the more professional lobbyists have realized that they can get more done just by throwing money around rather than providing any kind of expertise. As a result, lobbying on Capitol Hill used to be very extensively involving things like providing free trips to members of Congress and congressional staff. The famous one of Jack Abramoff, a lobbyist, a super lobbyist who, by the way, just got out of prison. He would fly members of Congress to Scotland to go play golf. He had a restaurant over on the other side of the hill over here that he owned, set aside a table 46, that was just for members of Congress and congressional staff to come get free dinners, wining and dining them, and did that on a nightly basis. He would provide sporting tickets, box seats to any sporting events to members of Congress. So that's sort of what lobbying became for a while. And then in 2000, right prior to 2006, I was just revulsed by this whole practice of how lobbying was being done here in Capitol Hill. So I drafted some lobby reform legislation to end wining and dining, end the free trips, require instant disclosure of any kind of lobbying activities. This was in 2005, and even though I could get some friends in Congress to introduce it, like Senator Russ Feingold or for that matter, back then it was Senator Barack Obama too, the bills would never go anywhere. and we couldn't even get a hearing on it. Then finally, in January 2006, the Department of Justice had just worked out a plea bargain with Jack Abramoff, that super lobbyist I was telling you about. And Jack Abramoff agreed to point the finger at all members of Congress whom he bribed. And suddenly, I didn't even have to leave my office. My phone just started ringing from members of Congress saying, hey, you know that lobby reform legislation? We'd love to sign on to that. You know, and so suddenly that whole reform legislation just moved very rapidly. It was called the Honest Leadership and Open Government Act of 2007. And of the many things it did, it banned whining and dining. So lobbyists cannot provide gifts to members of Congress or staff at all of any value, including free dinner. It restricted trips so that lobbyists cannot sponsor trips, and even organizations and corporations that hire lobbyists are limited to paying for no more than a one-day trip for a member of Congress, just long enough to fly them out to give a speech at their convention, for instance, and then fly them back. Lawmakers cannot fly in corporate jets anymore. It used to be a big deal for lobbyists to get on a corporate jet with a lawmaker and fly to Scotland and do whatever lobbying they were doing. They can't do that anymore. We also required electronic filing and disclosure of all lobbying financial activities every 3 months. And so that gives us some, real-time disclosure. So it was sweeping legislation. And by the way, one of the principal people behind it was Senator Barack Obama at that time. And, he ran upon that type of achievements partly in his presidential campaign. And, it's still recognized as one of the cleaner presidents we've ever had. However, not so successful anymore, but still not corrupt. He's really dealt with that. And it unfortunately, we've gone through full circle, though. Even though we achieved these huge accomplishments in 2007, and it really did change lobbying here on Capitol Hill. I'm a lobbyist. I'm a registered lobbyist, but as public citizen, we don't have money. I mean, I can't do whining and dining or pay for trips or anything like that. And since we banned that for other lobbyists, it sort of leveled the playing field quite a bit. Yeah. So suddenly, while I was being ignored on Capitol Hill prior to this 2007 law, suddenly I found myself almost as effective as any other of the K Street lobbyists in trying to get legislation through. And so, I've been a principal force behind a lot of legislation because of that ethics, the rule. However, we've gone full circle almost, because last year, the U.S. Supreme Court, and I know this is long, but I'm trying to give you some background as to what's going on here. Last year, the U.S. Supreme Court, in a horrible decision called Citizens United versus FEC, just out of the blue, ruled that corporations are to be treated as people under the Constitution, and therefore can make unlimited campaign expenditures, supporting and opposing candidates. For 100 years, we had banned corporate financing of campaigns. And then suddenly this new Supreme Court, which by the way was a George Bush Supreme Court, and that's why it became so conservative, suddenly ruled that corporations are to be treated as people and can spend unlimited amounts of money. So how that affected lobbying was suddenly I'm up against these K Street corporate lobbyists again, who now walk into a meeting and the member knows that K Street lobbyist can coordinate $500,000 in corporate expenditures to support or oppose him or her in the next election. So although we had this huge sweeping achievement of cleaning up the lobbying profession for a couple years, really this year we've sort of gone back to where lobbyists are now kingmakers once again, because now they can spend unlimited amounts of corporate money on elections. So that's kind of the cycle we've gone through.
All right.
Great.
Thanks.
By the way, I know this is sort of long-winded, but
It's all right.
because of the achievements of the Honest Leadership and Open Government Acts, I sent you some papers of some of the work I'm doing in Europe, and because of that, I've become recognized also in Brussels and Prague and elsewhere as being an authority on lobby reform, and so I frequently go out there and testify on lobby reform in Europe as well.
We're really grateful for them. We read.
Going out to Brussels next month too.
Oh, cool. But we read them and we are using some of the information you've given us for some texts.
Yeah, they're great.
Moving on.
What difference would it make if lobbying didn't exist?
Once again, I want to specify I'm not opposed to lobbying.
No.
And I think for any major democracy, if lobbying were banned, it would be very detrimental to the quality of governance. Mm-hmm. Because we elect these lawmakers who may or may not be any good, but no matter how good they are, they don't know everything. And the real role of lobbyists is to provide expertise and information to lawmakers, and that is a critical function in any mass democracy. If you had a small little democracy, then perhaps lawmakers could know everything that's going on. But if you have a large country like Denmark or the United States, lawmakers just aren't going to know everything. And so they've got to have contact with people who have expertise. The problem with the lobbying profession is that potentially corrupting nexus between lobbyists, money, and lawmakers. If you can break that corrupting nexus and return the whole profession of lobbying back to providing expertise and information, that's what the profession should be all about. To not have lobbying at all would leave lawmakers entirely blind as to what they're supposed